Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and for many of you introducing yourselves in the chat. I really enjoyed reading what people are proud of, whether it's surviving the heat, whether it's helping people get housed, proud of the steps that the military is taking to support sexual assault survivors. It's really wonderful to read all of these things. Someone has completed a protective order yesterday. People are proud to be here at this webinar, so thank you so much for sharing that. Someone got their community health worker certificate. Lots of incredible folks on the call today. Lots of people joining from other states as well. I see Ohio, Utah, Illinois, Georgia, Texas. So thank you all so much for showing up. You can continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. We'd love to see it and learn more about who is on the call. For me, my name is Bernison Wheeler. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Community Education and Outreach Manager at Women's Advocates, a nonprofit in St. Paul, Minnesota, dedicated to supporting survivors and their families. And I'm delighted to be co-presenting alongside E. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is E. I use any pronouns and I am the Outreach Programs Assistant here at Women's Advocates.
Thank you for that, E. And we encourage you all to take care of yourselves however you need during this webinar. And we will also be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the recording of the webinar, a PDF of the PowerPoint slides, and a certificate of attendance. If you hang around at the end, you will get downloadable links for both the certificate and the PowerPoint. So this is also a webinar, which means that attendees' videos and microphones are automatically turned off. Sometimes we get concerns or questions about that, so no worries. No one can hear or see the attendees at this time unless you are requesting to be unmuted. And you're welcome to submit any questions using the Q&A feature as per usual with all of our webinars, but we really want to emphasize this being a safe space to ask questions, to be curious, and let us know. You can also send it in the chat at any time. There'll be lots of opportunities to share your perspective using the chat and using other online contributions too. So we'll explain that more as we get there. And also the live transcript is on. If you do not want it on for any reason, you can simply click the live transcript button and then the button that says hide subtitles. You can always bring it back at any time if you change your mind. And then before we officially dive into today's webinar, I want to acknowledge and extend gratitude for our American Sign Language or ASL interpreters, Quincy and Janine. And please let us know if you're unable to see the active interpreter at any time during the webinar. You may need to change your Zoom view from a speaker to gallery to be able to see everyone. So myself, E, and Quincy should be the three people you can see on the screen right now. And then just a reminder to click the button, everyone, to send your messages to everyone so people can see your contributions as well throughout the webinar. So many of you have joined us last week for our first part of this two-part series, and it was on understanding domestic violence and the LGBTQIA2S+ relationships. So a lot of this information today will be building off of that, but no worries if you weren't able to attend that webinar last week. We have a recording of that, and it includes ASL interpretation. So we'll go ahead and put that link in the chat now in case you want to have it to reference later or to share with other people. And today we'll be continuing that conversation in honor of June as Pride Month, which not only celebrates LGBTQIA2S+ folks, but honors the 1969 Stonewall Uprising in Manhattan. Many of you may be aware of that, and it's dedicated to the fight for equal rights and to end discrimination and violence that LGBTQIA2S+ folks disproportionately experience. And if you're interested in learning more about the origins of Pride that many people know about, you can click the link on the screen, and then we'll also send it in the chat here to learn more about Pride Month. So for those of you who may be newer to Women's Advocates, I'd like to spend just a brief moment sharing more about us. Women's Advocates is a nonprofit organization in St. Paul, Minnesota, that offers a continuum of safety through our prevention programming, like these webinars, emergency shelter and advocacy services, and housing stability services for victim survivors of domestic violence and their families. We began in the early 1970s as a legal advice helpline that supported particularly women at that time who were seeking divorce and legal name change. On the helpline, our legal personnel found that many of the women they were speaking to were faced at a crossroads between experiencing abuse in their home or being homeless and on the streets by themselves or with their children. And they wanted to create a third option for people who were in this position. And by 1974, they had rallied enough money to purchase our first safe home to shelter women and children who have experienced abuse. And in the almost 50 years since, we have expanded, and our shelter is now 3 interconnected homes and have updated our mission statement, which you see on the screen here, to better reflect what it is we believe we do, which is to walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. And this does include all victim survivors of domestic violence, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. I know our name can sometimes be confusing, but that just kind of is about our roots and how this work got started in the 70s. But we are here to help, and you can learn more about our organization at wadvocates.org. And living our mission involves acknowledging the land at which our work takes place and also demonstrating our commitment to all survivors, especially survivors who identify as Native or Indigenous. As I read aloud, I encourage you all to think about your work and how you can support not only Native survivors, but also the Native community as a whole, including land back initiatives in your area. And you can read along and access other resources at the link on the screen. We'll also put it in the chat right now. The women's advocacy work takes place on Dakota land. The area that is now St. Paul was stolen from the Dakota people by the American government through centuries of wars, broken treaties, and acts of cultural genocide. Through incredible perseverance and resistance, the Dakota are still here and strong. Native women and girls face the highest risk of domestic violence, sexual assault, and intimate partner homicide. We express our gratitude for the Indigenous-led organizations who are working each day towards a world without domestic and sexual violence. And as an organization, we commit ourselves to supporting tribal sovereignty with the same fervor that we support the self-sovereignty of victim survivors. That is a condensed version, so there's a longer one on the site that is linked in the chat as well too, if you are interested.
Hello, everyone. One last note before we continue with the outline of today's webinar, and that involves a few reminders. So as Brennison said previously, this is an introductory webinar and a continuation on our first webinar, which was understanding domestic violence in LGBTQIA+ relationships. More information and tools are also going to be available in the further reading slides of this presentation and that previous presentation. The post-webinar email will also have a link to download a certificate of attendance, and a recording will be posted on our YouTube channel. Domestic violence related content affects everyone differently. We encourage you to prioritize caring for yourself during and after the webinar. So in the next 90 minutes, we're going to explore LGBTQIA intimate partner violence prevention and allyship recommendations, discuss safety and support planning for LGBTQIA+ survivors, and engage on how to promote healthy LGBTQIA relationships. So we'll start with a quick 90-second multiple choice poll about what brings you here to this training and what specifically you're hoping to learn about. I'm going to launch that now. So you should see it on your screen, and if you are not able to access the poll on your screen, feel free to also drop your response in the chat. You'll see each learning objective on the poll describes In the specific section of today's webinar, including prevention and allyship recommendations for supporting LGBTQIA+ survivors and promoting their health, safety, and healthy relationship skills. So I'll give folks a couple seconds here to put their response. And I'm going to close the poll in about 10 seconds. Thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts. I'm going to share the poll results with everyone now. And it looks like all of us are very interested in learning about the contents of this webinar, which is great. And if there's anything else that you're hoping to learn in the webinar, feel free to also post that in the chat. So I stopped sharing the poll results.
Thank you, E. So for this first section, we'll talk about prevention and allyship, which a lot of you indicated you are interested in learning. Someone in the chat put something that they're looking to learn is how to heal from unhealthy relationships as a queer non-binary person. Yeah, thank you so much for including that. We hopefully will have some time to chat about that in our healthy relationship section. And if not, that would be a really excellent webinar topic for more in-depth conversation at a later date. So thank you for including that. So I'm going to hand it over to E to kind of introduce this first slide, which you may recognize from one.
Thank you, Brennison. So this slide has some information about some of the terms that make up the LGBTQIA2S+ acronym and may be used in this presentation today. Mary Beth and I, in the previous presentation, also went in depth on what all these definitions mean. And you can take some time to look at the screen now and read those definitions. What we really want to underline here is that as service providers and as individuals, we want to make sure that people have the agency to share the terms with they want to be treated with. So if someone tells you, I identify with this term, then you can address them with that term. We really want to put agency back into people's hands and not assume anything about their identity or what terms they like to have used based on the relationships we see them in. Most of the terms talk about sexual orientation, which is often interchanged with gender identity. There's also discussions about two-spirit and intersex individuals and their inclusion in this category. So Brennison put some links in the chat with some more information about intersex and two-spirit identities as well to learn more about the terms paradox. So all of these terms are also available in depth in our first presentation and available in these slides. We really wanted to make sure that folks had an understanding of what each letter in the acronym means.
Thanks, Ian. If you have any specific questions or need any reminders throughout, you're welcome to send that in the chat, but we didn't want to harp on this too much in case people already have a solid understanding of this. So if you have done prevention work before, you're probably familiar with this concept that there are levels to prevention work. So public health folks may know about the idea of upstream versus downstream approaches. When there's a public health crisis like domestic violence, there are, of course, many different ways of addressing it. And many of you may already be doing work in, say, the secondary prevention. These are immediate responses to violence that address some of the short-term consequences of abuse. It can include access to emergency and medical care. Others of you may be more engaged with tertiary prevention, which can involve longer-term responses to violence, including healing-centered survivor support groups and abuse intervention or transformation programs. And then an upstream approach involves that primary prevention, which aims to stop violence before it starts, such as teaching healthy relationship skills in classrooms and working to reduce risks for relationship abuse and increase those buffers. And so now that we kind of have this shared understanding of the different levels, I would like to hear from all of you using this 2-question poll. So went ahead and launched that poll here. The first question is, which level of prevention, primary, secondary, tertiary, do you feel you currently influence the most? And then the second question is, which level of prevention do you want to focus on moving forward? I said that with weird enunciation. Which level of prevention do you want to focus on more moving forward? And you can think of specifically for working with survivors who identify within the LGBTQIA2S plus community, or just more generally, totally up to you. So give about 20 more seconds. All right, excellent. I'll go ahead and share the results here. So it looks like 52% of us who filled out the poll said secondary prevention is what they influence the most right now. And then 52% said that they want to focus on primary prevention more moving forward. And so a little chat opportunity here is for the level of prevention that you want to focus on. What specific ideas do you have that center the LGBTQIA+ community or survivors who identify within that community? And so, for example, many of you put primary prevention. So for those of you who put primary prevention of the level that you want to focus on moving forward, do you have any specific ideas of how you can center the LGBTQIA2S+ community for primary prevention? And you can go ahead and add those responses in the chat, or if you would like to be unmuted, you can message us directly and let us know. But I'll give about a minute or two for us to kind of brainstorm some ideas. Or if there's any efforts that you have already done within primary prevention that you feel does this, we'd love to hear that as well too. Someone in the chat is saying for primary prevention, helping survivors overcome the scarcity mindset when it comes to healthy LGBTQ+ relationships. So if you live in a rural or conservative community, etc. Yeah, that sounds like a great idea of kind of acknowledging that they're not alone, trying to kind of work towards reducing that stigma. Any other specific examples that we could think of? I'm reflecting a little bit more on the suggestion that was put in the chat about overcoming scarcity mindset in terms of rural or conservative communities. That might be justifications for like experiencing unhealthy or abusive relationships of, well, I don't know who else like I would be, you know, able to consider being in a relationship in, or just feeling really isolated in that way, and saying that it is possible to engage in healthy relationships outside of that person for sure. Other people are saying a primary prevention tool could be helping everyone to understand that we're all human and diversity is the garden of life. Other people are saying providing emotional support for the victims so they know they have a listening ear. Yeah, lots of different ways to support survivors, especially those who aren't identifying as straight or cisgender. People are saying providing resources for getting counseling and treating physical injuries. Another person said that they work at a volunteer victim advocate for military sexual assault victims. They're trying to move the focus from cis straight narrative to more inclusive language. It's still brushed aside as a whole. Yeah, being specific about naming those who do experience abuse can be really powerful, because if we don't, a lot of times people will assume that, you know, it's only a man and a woman, or just have a very narrow view of who can experience abuse. All right, so here are some examples of specific initiatives and efforts. Some of them have come up already in the chat. Others are maybe newer ones that we haven't talked about yet, but some examples in the 3 different levels of prevention. So Inclusive, healthy relationship skills, for example, for primary prevention, should be taught in multiple youth settings. So not only just in schools, but could also be in other aftercare programs, and just not relying on the one day that, someone like Women's Advocates comes to a health class. And maybe someone was sick or whatever, relying on that one day for that's the only time to talk about healthy relationship skills. We want this to kind of be threaded throughout their experience through a young age. And as we just talked about, it's really important to be explicit about the occurrence of abuse and LGBTQIA plus relationships in these engagements with youth and younger people, because many students that we have worked with directly have told us that they didn't think abuse was possible in same-sex relationships, or if it was, a student who identified as a woman saying that they had experienced, an uncomfortable situation that they didn't realize could be abuse because it was by another woman. And so those are all things to consider. And so sometimes this absence of conversation about the fact that abuse can happen in all relationships, and not just saying only all, but specifically naming them, can kind of confirm what survivors are told by abusive people, that they're not experiencing abuse because of their gender identity or because of their sexual orientation. And a key kind of component of primary prevention that centers LGBTQIA folks is that the space is affirming of their identities and experiences, which is what a lot of people are talking about in the chat, of how they want to build a culture and space that nurtures all of those identities and helps build, a strong sense of self for those who do identify as LGBTQ plus, and also their self-esteem, which many studies have found to be, a buffer against intimate partner violence. But again, I don't love the language of buffer because it kind of puts the onus on the survivor, like, oh, if only you had more buffers, you wouldn't have experienced this. That's definitely not what I'm implying here. So I wanted to be very clear about that. But in regard to secondary prevention, that first step of responding to the immediate impacts of abuse experienced by LGBTQIA2 plus folks. And I might start interchanging queer potentially too, because it is a little bit of a mouthful. But that, and we talked about it in the last webinar as well too, that for some folks, you want to just double check if they feel comfortable identifying as queer, because, it has been historically a slur. So that's something to keep in mind too. But recognizing and validating that it happens, if they do disclose that they've experienced abuse. And an example that I think of is when I was giving a presentation to a dental clinic, a dentist shared with me that one of her patients described experiencing abuse, and it was a patient who the dentist described as a well-off, healthy man, had told the dentist that his wife was abusing him. And she told me that she didn't really believe it. She kind of dismissed it and focused on evaluating his dental health. It made her uncomfortable. She shared that she hadn't really realized that women could be abusive or that men could experience abuse. And it kind of stunned her a bit, and she didn't know how to help him or if he even needed help. And that just kind of made me think of a similar minimization and denial, maybe even at a higher degree, happens to LGBTQIA plus folks all the time. So that immediate response, right, should be validation and safety and support planning that can honor and respect the gender identities and sexual orientations to prevent additional experiences of violence or harm or minimization for LGBTQIA survivors. And then lastly, tertiary efforts. They could include specific support groups. Maybe they're led by people who identify as queer themselves. Other people who are supporting, so maybe trauma providers, understanding the dynamics and the different kind of identity development and experience that a lot of LGBTQIA2 plus survivors in particular experience, and also making sure that there are programming specific, because there's a lot of them that are only specifically for cisgender men. And so there are transformation efforts that try to replace abusive behaviors with more healthy ones, but a lot of times they might not be as inclusive as they could be. So those are all some suggestions to consider as well. All right, so we have another model, and if you think of any other thoughts or reflections as we're going through this, I know it's kind of a lot of information. You're welcome to put it in the chat anytime. But levels of prevention can also pertain to us as individuals, so not just what kind of prevention does this fall under, but as a prevention worker, right, I can make efforts on an individual level, including how I think about domestic violence internally, my biases and my assumptions, and my own understanding about domestic violence and how it can be experienced by LGBTQIA plus folks. And how I think about domestic violence can also influence that bring outside my relationships with other people, whether that's my clients, coworkers, or family members, or friends, or other people who I know that might be experiencing abuse, and how I engage with them is very important and can influence a culture and a community. So kind of extends out toward where people gather and where they seek out, maybe community tabling opportunities. This past weekend, we were at an Oasis of Love event for Juneteenth to try to reach folks who may not have otherwise known about our work or the organization that we're a part of. Making those efforts can be really important as well too. And with this one being Pride, it's a little bit late in the game for this to be a new suggestions, but maybe for next year, if it's important to you, to let LGBTQIA survivors know that you are inclusive and welcoming and well-informed, is to show up to Pride events and is to be in community with them as well too. And so being able to have a presence also in community spaces like Women's Advocates does at Rondo and the Rondo Community Outreach Library and the Hmong American Partnership or WIC SNAP offices in St. Paul to provide advocacy in a more accessible and community-centric way. So trying to think of different outreach methods can be really supportive in that way too. And then that last outer ring, societal levels of prevention, that can include me voting for specific political candidates that are dedicated to issues that directly impact survivors, including housing and other public safety issues. And so this model versus the one with the river might be a little bit more helpful for people who don't already do prevention for their job. So thinking about which level you want to start with or focus on and brainstorming ways to center LGBTQ survivors in these efforts is definitely a worthwhile endeavor. Someone in the chat is saying that their org is tabling at Pride this weekend and will be there to represent the LGBTQIA2S plus community. Wonderful, thank you for including that. And so at all of those different levels, these are some specific examples. I won't walk through all of them, but these are all ways that we can start to inspire change at all levels of prevention, from individual to that ripple effect out to the society. And so I'm just wondering if any of these stand out to you as ways that you could see yourself supporting LGBTQIA2S plus survivors or holding LGBTQIA people who use abuse accountable for their actions. So you can pop them in the chat, any of the ones that stand out to you on the screen. Or maybe if you have any questions and you want additional information about how someone could implement bystander prevention strategies, or how people can be vocal about the need for legal protections and accessing mental health care, medical care, social services. Maybe I'll wait for at least like one person to put something in the chat that stands out to them. Okay, thank you. I'm seeing someone saying promoting healthy conflict resolution. That's awesome. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Bystander intervention, that's evidence-based. That's what someone else is putting in the chat, something that they would be interested in. Great. All right, thank you for that. We will continue. So the Northwest Network has this really incredible resource that I would highly recommend to everyone on this webinar, including this graphic, that outlines particular situations that LGBTQIA2+ survivors can find themselves in, and how utilizing existing advocacy tools can yield these positive outcomes. And so we're getting a little ahead because I know our next section is going to be a little bit more about safety and support planning, but I just got really excited about this one element. That's one advocacy tool among many others that you can utilize in your work. And so one that you'll see in terms of a situation is someone might say, I've tried everything I can to help him and I don't know what to do anymore. And then kind of using boundaries and safety and support planning. This person may have come to the conclusion now I can drive him to his AA meeting and I can take time to listen, but I know that I can't do everything for him. And so these are just kind of ways of showing up for people and being able to have our own boundaries and hold space for that, while also providing safety and support planning within those confines. Another example is someone saying, my friend's new girlfriend freaks me out. She was bragging about a fight she got into last week. I'm worried about my friends, but I don't want her girlfriend to come after me. And so kind of utilizing safety and support planning and also resources and community connections. This person may be in a situation where now they're saying, it turns out my friend was worried too. We agreed she won't tell her girlfriend my address or phone number so that I can be a safe person for her to stay with. She's talked with a domestic violence advocate and she and I worked on a safety plan together. So those are some concrete examples, and just one last one, a situation of saying, I keep telling her she has to leave, but she won't. And then utilizing domestic violence education, which kind of falls into that primary prevention we were talking about earlier, and also boundaries. They might come to the conclusion of saying, I understand that leaving an abusive relationship is hard. My friend will leave if and when it feels right to her. Meanwhile, I'm here to listen. So those kind of show you different examples of situations and how to actually put those advocacy tools into practice. And so you can learn more at the link that we're going to put in the chat if you want to kind of see more context for this graphic. And someone in the chat said the survivor is the best determinant of when it is best to leave. It's not always safe, 100%. Yeah, we're going to reiterate that a lot today too, but thank you for kicking us off. And so now that we have some examples for these 6 advocacy tools, I'd like us all to kind of reflect on how we may already use or how we may not use these different approaches in our work in connections with survivors, especially survivors who might identify as LGBTQIA2+. So go ahead and launch this next poll. It is 2 questions. So the first question is, which of these advocacy tools do you utilize the most in your work with survivors, especially LGBTQIA+ survivors? And then which of the tools do you want to integrate more into your work with survivors? So I'll give you all a few moments to reflect on that and select the choice that best represents how you feel for both of these questions. I'll give about 15 more seconds here. All right, I will go ahead and end the poll and share it. So it looks like 30% of those who responded to the poll said that resources and community connections are the advocacy tools that you utilize the most in your work with survivors, especially LGBTQIA2S plus survivors. And then 24% want to integrate safety and support planning more into their work with survivors. So for that second question, for maybe those of you who put safety and support planning, are there specific ideas how that chosen tool could be implemented in your work and also center LGBTQIA to those plus folks? And I see someone has raised their hand. Sometimes that can happen as an accident. I do see it went away, but if you do have a question, you can put it in the chat or in the Q&A. Someone in the chat said they really like the safety and support planning worksheet that we shared in a previous training. Yeah, we'll definitely bring that back up again too. Someone wants to know what repair relationship means. So if we kind of go back to this, there's certain things, repair relationship. Okay. So repair can kind of mean, it can include a process of either a survivor coming out as LGBTQIA2S+ and kind of navigating reactions to that within relationships. So maybe there was harm done where, you know, a parent or someone in the family had made a homophobic or a transphobic comment and didn't know the identity of the person in their family. And that can start to try to rebuild the relationship to get to a place where not only do they feel safe to be themselves, but also do they feel safe to disclose that they've experienced abuse as well with their family. So a lot of it can do with like family or community members or, you know, other people in the survivor's life, but it could relate to advocates too, of like having to repair relationships with advocates or other people in your organizations. So hopefully that helped answer the question. Someone in the chat said that they look at safety planning as kind of like if you're planning for a fire, have a go back, have a plan, have a backup plan, practice a plan, connecting with supports that they have, and making up a code word if they aren't safe. Yeah, that's definitely a huge part of safety planning too. And that will be really unique to the survivor, whether leaving is something that they want as a part of their plan or if it's staying safe while remaining in the relationship. So there's a lot of different nuances to that too. Okay. Well, thank you so much for participating in that poll. Just wanted to give some more. We had some questions in our last webinar about what can be done at an organizational level as well as an individual level. And so some people, depending on whether you're in leadership at an organization, you might have more or less power within the organizational level, but they're all suggestions that you can make to people who might have the ability to sustain those changes. But when I think about organizational level, I think about walking through the first moment that people are making connection with your organization all the way through until their last interaction. So for us at the shelter, it might be our crisis line. Where they're calling us and connecting with us for the first time. And so that can even include, you know, crisis resource advocates answering the phone, letting them know what their name and their pronouns are to kind of set the tone for, I'm aware that like I can't assume what your pronouns are just by hearing your voice on the phone. So just kind of setting the tone for that. All the way to the last interaction, which for many folks at Women's Advocates is their last day, whether they're transitioning into our aftercare program or housing stability program, or if they are, you know, leaving under different circumstances too. So what would that experience be like walking from the first moment to the last interaction for LGBTQIA2S+ survivors? And so it can be really important for us to also think about things that would be in the physical space. So whether that's inclusive intake forms, so that could look like having a space for maybe what's your name on your driver's license, because sometimes we do need that information, but also making sure that there's another line of like, what do you want us at, our organization to call you? And acknowledging that that might be different and we don't need an explanation why, and just allowing that to kind of be the standard that we always ask. And it's interesting too, because people are really cool about that with like nicknames too. Like my full name is Brennison. Sometimes I'll ask people to call me Brenny, and that's like not exactly what's on my license, but no one really questions that. So it should be the same with people's personal names too. So those can be some physical indicators, and that's like gives them an impression. If you're at the doctor's office, they're starting to integrate that into their forms too, so that they can provide more holistic and inclusive care too. So doing that at advocacy agencies can be really important, including a spot for them to share their pronouns if they would like to, and always letting them know that if any of the information on the form changes, they can always update it or let us know. And so just being able to have, if you do have forms that are filled out by people at your agency, making sure that they take that into account and are not heteronormative. Some places might have language that specifically say, indicate like as a woman, or assume that the abusive person is their husband, or just look for things like that on your forms and on your pamphlets and information that might make those assumptions and not be inclusive. Another thing is continual training opportunities, like these webinars, but there's a lot of other ones out there too that aren't just like one and done of like, okay, you watch this 90-minute thing, you're great now, we can call ourselves inclusive. Like we want to make sure that we're doing the work. And making sure as a leadership, we have multiple opportunities to connect with specifically organizations that do, center LGBTQ folks, like women's advocates. That is not our core mission. While it is a part of our mission, there's other organizations in Minnesota, like Outfront, where that is their core mission. And a lot of people who do identify with that community also work there and are able to provide those trainings. And so this also extends to things online. So social media, are you posting things? If you're posting anything, do you have like a little sign or a sticker that says all are welcome with the rainbow flag? Or like there are certain indicators that queer survivors might look for to indicate to them that, oh, this might be a safer place for me, or they might understand me a little bit more than others who don't. So what does your website look like? What language do you use there? So just kind of thinking of if I had this identity, if you don't already, what I feel included, what I feel like this is a welcoming place for me to go to. Also having non-discrimination policy. So like it can go all the way to policy work as well too, if you're more on the HR leadership side of things related to gender identity, gender expression, and sexuality. So not only for discrimination within people who utilize your services, but also trying to cultivate a welcoming staff for people who do identify as LGBTQIA+. So having more people who have that shared identity in a space can help, make it feel more inclusive. Because if people who do identify as queer want to work at that organization, it doesn't always translate in that way, but it might increase chances that, other people feel safe. And not to say, and we'll talk about internalized homophobia too. So not to say that just because you hold an identity doesn't mean you can't perpetuate systems that cause harm, but we just wanted to talk about that. And then another thing too, could be like having employees include their pronouns in their email signature. Just like there's just a lot of different things that can be those indicators. But this last piece about actively committing to anti-homophobia, anti-biphobia, and anti-transphobia are really important too. And I just wanted to like have a little note about that, in the sense of when people think of the word phobia, they think like, oh, it's just fear. And they're like, oh, I'm not afraid of people who are gay. But they might make statements like that, but then they'll say things that are really hurtful or hateful, or are, it can be down to things like people can be like visibly uncomfortable, or people you can tell that they don't want to learn, or that they don't want to be educated, or they don't want to know, like even dismissal and minimization, like that, those things are all part of it too. Like just as when we talk about racism, it's not there's the microaggressions, like there's different ways too. And so people might make sweeping statements of like, oh no, I'm not homophobic. But they don't want to be inclusive. Like they don't want to be welcoming. And so those are all things to really think about as well too. And just, I'm not going to read through everything on the individual level, but one main thing that I want to focus on is how, kind of similar to how a trauma-informed approach treats everyone, regardless of whether they've disclosed if they've experienced trauma, with a lens that exemplifies non-coercion, collaboration, empowerment, trust, safety, non-judgment. Like we embed all of these components into our advocacy, regardless, right? But we can also operate from a lens that doesn't assume heteronormativity, meaning that we don't make assumptions that everyone is straight and cisgendered. And again, for people who might not be familiar, cisgender means that someone identifies with the sex that they were assigned at birth as their gender identity. And so we instead value affirmation, curiosity, respect, and validation to everyone, knowing just as if we can't tell that someone has experienced abuse just by looking at them, we can't tell if someone identifies as LGBTQIA just by looking at them. So leaving space for their own self-discovery journey and their growth within their identity is really important too, especially if you work with them over extended periods of time. Okay. I noticed there's some things in the chat. Is everything resolved with the interpreters? Everything's good?
If you want, I can take over the next couple of slides because I do not have the ability to host the interpreters. So I can take over the next slide and then do my portion of the presentation.
Okay, I guess I'm just confused because you should be able, everyone is a co-host. So
no, I don't have the ability.
What is needed to be done?
One of our interpreters needs to be spotlit. Yeah.
Okay.
There we go. Perfect.
I think it's fixed, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So yeah, so there's a lot of different things on that individual slide. Let me know if there's any specific questions on here. Okay. Great. Thank you for the clarification. So lots of different things. Let us know if you want any support with that. But we will have many other opportunities to discuss that further too. All right. So some of you are saying that you might not have inclusive language or you might not have inclusive materials. And so with that, there are a bunch of free ones that you can order through Futures Without Violence. And so we'll put those links in the chat now, but there's a Caring for You or Caring Healthy Relationships. Wow. Can I read? Caring Relationships, Healthy You posters created by Futures Without Violence. And those are posters that you can have in your organization. They can be posted in public areas. They also have these safety cards too that can be used by advocates to walk through different relationship dynamics that might be more specific to the LGBTQIA+ community. And so you can click on those links in the chat. Someone says that the first link didn't work. So we will go ahead and let's see if I can, oh, weird. All of those aren't working except for the very last one. So the very last link has how to use them. And then it also has all of the links to the poster and the safety card. So I'm gonna throw those in the chat again. So these should work. Here's the poster, and then here's the safety card, and then here's the trans and gender non-conforming card. So hopefully those work if you're grabbing those links now. And we'll try to make sure to update those links in the follow-up email, since the slides are already out there. But yes, please check out that resource. You're welcome to order those for free and also learn more about how to use them. So we're going to take a moment just to kind of talk a little bit more about shifting to cultural respects, and I'll let you go ahead and chat about that.
Thank you so much, Brenison. So In this presentation, we wanted to make sure that we gave a lot of examples to providers about how they can continue to make their spaces more inclusive to LGBTQIA2S+ survivors. So here are some things that Brenison and I brainstormed about language specifically. I'm not going to read all of them out loud, but some of them that I wanted to point out that are very simple to implement is using gender inclusive language at all times. So just defaulting to saying words like spouse, partner, siblings, parents, and understanding the difference between intent and impact when a mistake is made. All of these kind of go hand in hand to help make the language we use with survivors more inclusive and can implement changes at an organizational level. Embedded in the chat as well is a quick and easy guide to they them pronouns. So this is a it's a link to a purchasable book that just kind of has a guide on how to use and implement they them pronouns, and a link will be posted in the chat shortly for that as well, just because it might be new information to some people, so we also wanted to provide a resource on that. But before we move on to the next slide, I'm going to launch a poll as well. So let me get that poll ready. So this poll's question is, which of the following have you heard in your community? It includes a multitude of statements, and the results of this poll are completely anonymous. So we just wanted to know from the folks in our presentation which of these statements they might have heard being said in their community, whether that be in their workplace, where they live, or out in public. So I'm going to give folks a couple of seconds here to look at the poll options and feel free. Okay, I'm going to give folks about 15 more seconds to submit in the poll. Okay, and I'm going to share the results of that poll now. So out of all these statements, it sounds like a lot of us have heard that there's no excuse for violence in same gender relationships, just as there isn't for opposite gender relationships, which is absolutely true. It looks like the second most popular option was folks have heard other people say that domestic violence in LGBTQIA2S+ relationships is too complicated because it's hard to tell who the abuser is. A lot of folks have heard the statement that violence in LGBTQIS+ relationships shouldn't be normalized, but also that there aren't any specific resources for survivors or abusers in my area, specifically for LGBTQIA2S+ people. With that being said, I'm going to go to the next slide, but thank you everyone for your input on that poll. We really wanted to get an understanding of where people were when it comes to their community and the resources around them. So on the screen here, you see kind of kind of like a bubble, again, like Brenison showed earlier. There's the light blue one where it says less validation of the relationship and the self. This includes lack of inclusion in programs, which you talked about before, homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. The survivor may be closeted and can't reach out for support. The abuser may blame the survivor's identity on the abuse. And then how it's different from straight domestic violence. Some communities may not identify partner abuse as a community issue, and the survivor may have to use the same support systems as the abuser. So some facts from the American Psychiatric Association are that transgender people are nearly twice as likely to experience intimate partner violence in public areas as people who do not identify as transgender. Transgender people of color specifically are 3.69 times more likely to experience intimate partner violence in public areas as people who do not identify as transgender people of color. LGBTQ Black or African American survivors of intimate partner violence are nearly twice as likely to experience physical violence as those who do not identify as LGBTQ and Black or African American. So we can see here that there's a lot of overlapping between all of the identities that we may hold as an individual, because an individual isn't just LGBTQ or just a survivor or just a specific race, identity, or ability. So with this being said, we can see how abuse in LGBTQIA2S+ relationships may be different than straight domestic violence for a variety of reasons, including that lack of validation from the self, societal pressures such as homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and also the ways in which factors like age, race, ability, and other identities may overlap.
Thanks, Eam. And for the sake of time, I know we've been having such a robust conversation. I'm going to quickly show a couple of the slides, but we're not going to dive in depth with them because we don't have enough time. We want to get to everything. But this is just some suggestions that we had in terms of language to avoid when working with LGBTQIA2S+ survivors. And then we also had some more recommendations for what language to embrace. And so again, this will all be included in the slides that you'll receive in about 30 minutes. So no worries if you wanted to dive a little bit deeper into this. And then this is a third one about questions we might get if, like, what do I do if I get someone's pronouns wrong? Some people have like a fear of that, which, you know, the goal is to be able to correct yourself, not overtly kind of apologize and make it draw more attention to them or make it about you or whatever the case is. So just kind of being able to make note of it and make a commitment to supporting people and having their pronouns be respected and also respecting them yourselves. So those are some specific examples of how to do that. All right. And then these are just, again, something to look at later when you have more time. These are more tangible questions to kind of ask yourself of like the work doesn't really stop at the end of this webinar, right? It's like, oh, I attended it, I listened, I can check that off my to-do list. We want you to also really engage in these questions beyond this webinar and take what you've learned and what you've thought of to other people at your organization or other people in your life as well too. So these are some specific questions to consider internally or with other people as well too. Okay, so now we'll transition into our safety and support planning for LGBTQIA2S+ survivors. And so we'll start this discussion by introducing this graphic that can visually represent a choice that many LGBTQIA2S+ survivors face at multiple points in their relationship. And often one of the first questions survivors get are either, why did you stay, or why can't you just leave? And so our intention with this graphic is to lay out how challenging experiencing domestic violence is and how LGBTQIA2S+ survivors in particular have to weigh out the pros and cons of each decision. So just take a moment to take a look at the left of the screen. These are all factors that contribute to LGBTQIA2S+ survivors' decision making about what would happen if they left the abusive relationship and sought out support. And so a really important note is that this isn't comprehensive or things that all LGBTQIA2S+ survivors face. There may be other different or additional factors depending on that person's specific situation and circumstances. So I wanted to make sure that that isn't named. So just take a look at that left side, take a moment to reflect and think of if you've considered those things before in supporting a survivor. And you can put anything that stands out to you in the chat. And then now if you, oh, someone in the chat said homeless due to lack of familial support is something that stood out to them. Yeah, and I mean, that's not something that's unique to only LGBTQIA2 plus survivors. There's plenty of straight cisgendered people who don't have family support, but it might not be because of their gender identity or because of their sexual orientation. They might not have that support for other reasons. So that's what might make it more unique. Other people are saying fear of alienating friend group and fear of being outed or of being outed, yeah. Or they might have a fear of coming out themselves as well. Other people are saying fear of alienating a friend's group or community is real. It forces your, quote unquote, forces your community to pick sides. Yeah, a lot of people are resonating with this, having to explain gender identities when disclosing abuse. Yeah. And I also like the level of education that some people have to do too, the burden of like having to educate, not only describe and just share what someone's identity is, but having to really do the emotional labor of explaining that to people who might not understand is real too. And then now if you take a moment to look through the right side of the screen. So these are all things that an LGBTQIA2+ survivor may consider when they're thinking about remaining in an abusive relationship and not attempting to leave. We try to use the avoid language like stay, because again, it puts the onus on them of like, oh, they're choosing to do this. But again, as we can see from this, it's not that simple. And as you're looking through this list, I just want to remind everyone that, as a lot of us know, leaving is the most dangerous time for all survivors, but especially LGBTQIA2+ survivors. And so if you attended our first webinar, you may have remembered the concept of the double closet, which we kind of just alluded to, where LGBTQIA2 survivors are not only having to face the repercussions and hardships of disclosing their experience of abuse with others, who may cause them a new form of harm, but they also have to face the results of revealing their social identities, whether it's gender identity or sexual orientation, and also other intersecting identities too, to complete strangers or to people who claim that they love them but might not do so unconditionally. And so there may be survivors who are more afraid for their safety if a family member were to find out that they were LGBTQIA2+, then they are of their abusive partner. So validating that fear is really important too. And again, always a reminder that all survivors are experts of their own experiences. So trusting them, not trying to convince them otherwise or say, oh no, your own mom won't do that, or invalidating them. They really do know best. And so does anyone have any reactions that they want to share after assessing those two options from the lens of an LGBTQIA2+ survivor? Anything from the right side stand out to anyone? Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. So continuing on with this, our second part, focusing on safety, there are some specific safety considerations when a survivor identifies as LGBTQIA2+. And so expanding on this point is this idea of holistic safety. And so the textbook definition of safety is described as this state of being free from harm or danger. And we assert that holistic safety refers to the presence of three different kinds of safety. So we'll start with internal. When we feel internally safe, we usually have a regulated nervous system. So this means that we're not activated into a state of flight, fight, freeze, or fawn. It means that our window of tolerance is wide and we're less likely to turn to states of hyperarousal, such as intense anxiety, or hypoarousal, like completely shutting down. And so for LGBTQIA2+ folks specifically, the need for internal safety is often dismissed. Emotional abuse and feeling rejected, minimized, not accepted, belittled, or misunderstood by people who are supposed to love and care about us can cause this sense of emotional unsafety and disrupt our sense of internal safety, which can deny us of our overall sense of feeling safe. And so when we're emotionally and intellectually safe, our internal safety can be promoted. People might be more familiar with external safety, and they might use it interchangeably with the word safety itself. But being in a space with, zero tolerance for homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, it's really important to have that as a part of external safety, because the language is the first step to dehumanization. So like our words really do matter, and the things that we say really do matter, because we have found that that rhetoric can escalate into physical threats or assaults, and that those words are harmful enough in themselves as well too. But kind of referring to external impacts, whether finances, finances can be used as a threat, of saying, you won't have any money to support yourself if you leave. That's not being externally safe if someone's being threatened from a financial standpoint. Relational safety. And so relational safety is what can really create this chasm in our sense of safety. And it's often really not talked about, but it does intersect with internal and external safety. And so relational safety is about having people we can depend on, who support us, who connect with us, who hold space with us, again, who validate, affirm, and respect us. And that extends to the digital world too. So making sure that we're not using social media or other things on our phones to cause harm, or post personal information or things that they didn't have permission or consent to share themselves. And so having these personal and professional relationships that are accepting of our gender identities, our sexual orientations, our perspectives, our experiences, that can really be an opportunity to help promote their relational safety. And so now that we've talked about those three, we're going to move into our very last poll, which is about these three different types of safety. So the first question is which type of safety do you focus on? Very similar to our past polls. Which type of safety do you focus on when working with LGBTQIA2+ survivors? And the second question is what type of safety do you want to emphasize more? Someone in the chat is sharing their own personal experience, and they say, when I came out late in life and was with my wife, we had a very abusive relationship that was very codependent, and I loved her, so I was so confused and torn on what to do and how to do it. Yeah, absolutely. I think that is not an uncommon experience, and that it takes a lot of advocates, many of us who are on the call here, to be dedicated in being able to provide that support that you may have needed at that time. So I appreciate you sharing that. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. So it looks like 59% said that they focus on external right now, which is very common. And then there's a split between 41% internal and 41% relational. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Hopefully that gives you kind of a catalyst to think more about relational safety as well too, of what does that mean and how does it, why would it matter to ask how their other relationships are? Because they might be experiencing abuse not only in their intimate relationship, but also in their familial relationships too. Okay. So this is a little bit about supporting holistic safety. I'm going to put this link in the chat about learning more about LGBTQIA2+ survivor safety planning. There's a lot of specific considerations that can be really important for those of you who want to work on promoting safety. We don't have time to go over all of it today, but please check out that link. But one specific consideration that I wanted to emphasize from that document is that it's crucial to do safety planning in a way that allows for the survivor's continued community involvement. And so that can be especially true for survivors who may not be able to rely on traditional support systems such as family members or their faith community. So avoiding community gatherings, social events, places frequented by the abusive person may isolate an LGBTQIA2+ survivor from their very community that would otherwise serve as the survivor's primary support post either experiencing abuse or leaving an abusive relationship. And then as we talked about before too in the previous slides, LGBTQIA2+ survivors may also risk isolation when they report an assault by someone else in their community, because some might think that involving law enforcement can be viewed as betrayal or lead to retribution or a loss of community ties if they were to do that. So those are all really important things to consider. And we have more resources that are more general for safety planning there. But one way that we can support the safety of LGBTQIA2+ survivors is to be aware of the very real barriers that many people face in accessing services. I'm actually going to ignore the men's key. We're just running low on time, and I'll make sure we have time for the third section. But these are just barriers to accessing services. And so I want you to kind of look at them and maybe start to brainstorm what your thoughts are on actions that you can take in your organization to promote inclusivity and increased access for LGBTQIA2+ survivors. So take a moment to brainstorm. I'm going to show you a list. We're not going to read through all of it, but these are some examples that kind of replace those barriers and say, oh, instead of these barriers, here are some inclusive measures as well too. So if any stand out to you, you can put them in the chat. We're also going to put in the chat a link to learn more if you are interested in learning more about where those barriers came from. It was a source that really evaluated programs and assessed what the barriers were. One thing I think can be really hard to do for people is to speak out when someone in your organization harasses or insults, or dead names or misgenders or whatever the case is every single time. That was another thing of like, every single time someone does it, it's like, oh, I did it once, I'm fine. But it's like, no, consistently showing up for people and reminding them that, not accepting others and not being inclusive is not tolerated, and acknowledging the impact of their words and offer alternative behavior. So, what you said was actually really homophobic. Maybe just don't say it again in the future. Just want to hold you accountable for that. Or B, here's another way of thinking about it. And so just creating a space for that too. Okay, so just a few more notes before we wrap up this section. This is just about strengthening support networks and how this in particular can be emphasized as helpful for LGBTQIA2+ survivors, and how we as advocates or other people in their life can contribute to strengthening their support networks. So there's a lot of different ways on the screen of ways that we can bolster support outside of ourselves as provider too. And one important note when engaging in these efforts is always ensure that connecting with any family or friends or coworkers is that the contact is directed explicitly by the survivor, because similar to how we don't assume that all survivors' families are supportive, aware of the abuse, or how they would respond to knowing that information, we don't want to assume that family, friends, or other people in the survivor's life know about their gender identity or their sexual orientation, or that the survivor even wants them to know. And this on the screen mentions support planning, and other people in the chat said that this was really helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this link in the chat. It's on page 15 of this link is the support planning checklist. So this can be really supportive of like, these are some specific support items that you might brainstorm, because when you ask a survivor, a lot of times they might say, oh, I don't know what I need. Everything feels broken, or everything feels like I need something from it and I don't know where to start. So this could be a way of figuring out what to start. They might read through this and say, oh my gosh, I didn't even know that someone could help me with transportation. I didn't even think of that. Or maybe because of their relationship with their identity, they might not consider that to be an option. So being able to assess that, what would be the boundaries, the details, conditions of that support, and being able to see if other people in their life would be able to provide it. And so those are some things to keep in mind, especially as we've talked about the unique impacts on being able to feel supported in the community after disclosing that they've experienced abuse. And then we're going to just end on a brief note before going into healthy relationships.
Thank you, Brennison. So this is just some more examples of everyday allyship that promotes safety for LGBTQIA2S plus people. I'm not going to read through every single box on here, but I did want to make a note about not making assumptions. And that can include not making assumptions about the identities that the survivor may hold, and not making assumption about the type of abuse they may experience, which kind of goes in tandem with that idea of the double closet, when someone has to come out not only as a survivor of abuse, but also as an LGBTQIA2 plus person. Having a baseline understanding about the LGBTQIA2S plus community, which means reading historical resources, hearing from other people in the community, and taking to heart the advice and guidance that they provide you and your organization. Some of these have already been shared, but also being an active bystander, always emphasizing the agency of the survivor to disclose what they want, when they want, and making sure that your space is accessible regardless of identity. So with that being said, I'm going to move on to part 3, which is engaging in promoting healthy LGBTQIA2S plus relationships. So as Brennison talked about previously, there is the concept of internalized homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. So one thing that we really wanted to address when we talk about healthy relationships is this concept of internalized homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, which is a form of internalized oppression that can be prolonged, that can be caused by prolonged exposure to oppression, discriminatory attitudes, can be conscious or unconscious, results in a lot of shame, which can include the survivor not wanting to report abuse, or the survivor not wanting to leave an abusive relationship due to that internalized shame, as well as fractured or strained relationships that the survivor may have with their family or community. But what it isn't is an excuse that justifies abusive behavior, but it may be something that appears in an unhealthy or abusive relationship. So my notes. So when discussing confronting and transforming internalized homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, we wanted to emphasize that it is not something that happens overnight, and it may be a non-linear process for many. These are just some concepts that may help an individual confront and transform these internalized oppressions. There are many more out there, but we wanted to provide some examples to begin to promote healthy relationships and kind of give survivors the tools that they may need to begin that journey of confronting these internalized oppressions. So some healthy relationship skills that we put together for this presentation include affirming a partner, setting boundaries, which we do not have time to get completely into setting boundaries, but we have a webinar on putting boundaries into action that can be dropped in the chat, curious and respectful inquiry, and expressing needs and concerns in a healthy manner, which then ties into navigating conflict. So all of these skills come together to kind of begin to promote healthy relationships within LGBTQIA2S plus relationships, which can then support survivors as they begin to seek out healthy relationships and recover from being in an abusive relationship. So the first one is affirming your partner, and this can look many different ways in an LGBTQIA2S plus relationships. We just have some examples here, such as always respecting names and pronouns, even when those change, supporting an individual and coming out when they want to, who they want to, keeping that information private, and also supporting them through external displays of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia they may experience in their community or at work. The second component of that is to create boundaries. So these are boundaries that are just existing in interpersonal relationships, but we have boundaries with people like across all aspects of our life, our family, our intimate relationships, our community, And we want to give survivors the tools to put boundaries into action. So here are just some examples of that, such as saying, I need time to think about this, or I can stay for a specific amount of time, or I'm going to stop communicating with you in this manner if you keep bringing up this topic. Setting those boundaries can help survivors regain agency from a previously abusive relationship and promote a healthy relationship. So if folks have any ideas of other boundaries or other phrases they might hear when exerting boundaries, feel free to put those in the chat. These are just some examples of boundaries that might be heard in interpersonal relationships. Someone in the chat said these are great examples. Thank you. And if anyone else wants to provide any other examples that they can think of in the chat, feel free to do so. I'll give folks about 30 seconds. Someone in the chat said, yes, I need to use these more. Even folks who are providers who work directly with survivors can exert boundaries in their personal lives as well. And it's important that we do that to continue to have the energy to do the work that we do. One person said, I can't talk with you right now, but let's schedule a meeting for tomorrow. That's awesome. Another one is, if you continue to disrespect my pronouns, I will have to stop interacting with you. That's a great example of a boundary that an individual might place in an intimate relationship or a relationship they might have with their family or in their workplace. That's a great one. Thank you. So some survivors that folks may work with may ask about how they can actually start to implement boundaries. One thing that we suggest is to use boundaries that are driven by their values. So here are some examples of that. So if someone really values emotional safety, a boundary they might set might be, I'd like a space to openly express my emotions where I'm not judged or dismissed. If someone values privacy, a boundary they might set at work or in public would be, I don't want to be asked my experiences with same gender relationships at work or in public. If someone values anti-racism, they might set up a boundary such as, just because me and my partner are both LGBTQ+ does not mean that we can't still perpetuate racism. I've made it clear that my partner and I want to hold each other accountable when it comes to being anti-racist. So setting boundaries as a couple can also help individuals feel more empowered to make those boundaries and discuss them more openly. One person in the chat said, I've started sharing with folks when they hurt me and sharing my feelings openly. That's a great boundary to set. Is, this is really upsetting to me. This is why, if you continue to do it, I'm gonna have to stop talking to you. So giving survivors the tools they need to figure out what boundaries they want to set with who and what values those boundaries hold for them. With that being said, there's also the opportunity for them to have respectful inquiry with their partner. So for folks who this might be their first same gender relationship, they might say like, this is my first same gender relationship, but I feel like this behavior is still harmful, even if we're both the same gender. One person might say, I know you use multiple sets of pronouns, how should I use them? And that might give them the opportunity to set a boundary. They might say, can we talk about this term you used when you introduced me to your friends? And that might be the opportunity for them to have a discussion about their identities. Another one is saying, I want to know who and where you are out to respect those boundaries that we put in place previously, and who I talk to about our relationship. Another one might be, I want to be a safe person that you can talk to about your sexuality and gender identity and expression. How can I support you now and in the future? So these are just some examples of ways that folks can have curious, respectful inquiry in an LGBTQIA2S+ relationship to provide them with that agency to continue into a healthy relationship. With that being said, one other component we wanted to talk about is navigating conflict, especially because of misconceptions we have about conflict. So one myth that might come up is conflict is a sign that your relationship is in trouble and you should avoid it at all costs. The fact is that conflict is a natural and inevitable part of any relationship, and healthy conflict brings people closer. One thing that we really wanted to highlight is that conflict in LGBTQIA2S+ relationships is just drama, or it doesn't happen, or it's always based in jealousy. These are misconceptions that people might have about conflict in these relationships. The fact is that conflict should not be ignored or belittled, but worked through in a healthy manner. Conflict, sometimes people think that means that the relationship is broken or doomed, or that it's a threat to one's safety, but there are healthy ways to navigate conflict. And there are healthy conflicts and unhealthy conflicts as well. So some example of healthy conflict is that it's sensitive to the harm caused and its impacts. It's working towards a shared understanding, and the individuals are willing to accept or be influenced by the other ideas. It's more of a conversation, and it's really trying to understand where the other person is at in the conflict. Unhealthy conflict can look more like damage than repair. So living in the conflict rather than moving forward. It might include the desire to win or be right. And it might include being closed off to the other person's viewpoints. So in that case, one person might be trying to exert control by continuing a conflict or promoting a conflict and trying to win a conflict. So one way to healthily address and respond to conflict in LGBTQIA2+ relationships can sound like some of these speech bubbles. So focusing on how an individual feels and not making accusatory statements. Bringing up conflict in a timely manner instead of letting it harbor resentment. You know, those misconceptions that conflict is just drama or just based in jealousy, making sure to bring it up and be open about it. Describing the situation at hand instead of accusing or belittling a partner. So something someone might say is, I want to understand why you think two men or two women can't hurt each other. Or saying, I know this is new to the both of us, but that behavior already crosses a boundary I already told you about. Or saying, you know, what you said really hurt me, and you calling it just drama makes it hurt even more. So being able to challenge those misconceptions, use I statements, and really making sure the conflict is collaborative, reparative, and open, rather than trying to make it something that one person can win over the other person.
Yeah, and one thing I just wanted to add before we kind of move into resources, I know we touched on it just a little bit, but with affirmations, like affirming your partner in your relationship, and some of you were talking about like how can we work through healing in a new relationship, and sometimes this can be, you know, a newer concept because you weren't affirmed in your past relationship or that hasn't been modeled for you. And so being able to say things like, I trust you to come out to your family, friends, workplace when you're ready is way more affirming than saying, if you're serious about me, you'll come out to your family, or, you know, things that are based in threats and not allowing them to go at their own pace. And just allowing for, again, that development, saying, I will always respect your name and pronouns, even if those change. So those things can all feel really affirming, especially when survivors have experiences where their partner was the opposite. So these are some things, some green flags that people can look for if they're said within their new relationships moving forward too. So that leads us to just a few more minutes left of the webinar to go over some resources, and we'll hang around for a bit if there's any questions. But we have a bunch of Minnesota-specific resources on the left, and then I know we have folks from outside of the U.S. or from outside the U.S., but outside of Minnesota. So some national and international resources to continue the work of learning more, and so you can look those up. We also have some more links for further reading. Someone said they think of those affirmations in close friends as well. Yeah, I think that's definitely not limited to just partners. It's other people in the community or other people in your life too. So lots of different readings and ways to continue. Also click the links throughout the slides too. And we also just wanted to reiterate the importance of exposing yourself to LGBTQIA2S+ joy, being able to embrace that, of not only just learning about oppression and violence and harm, but also being able to witness and, you know, pay tribute to the joy that a lot of folks are sharing online. Some of my personal faves on here that I follow and watch very closely is Adrienne Marie Brown, also Roxane Gay, and Jessamine Stanley. Those are some of the ones that I follow and really love a lot of the stuff that they will share with the world. So there's some other videos too to learn more if you're interested. But we'd also really like to know your feedback, especially if you attended the first one. But we want to learn more about how this was for you. So let us know any feedback. It's very short. It's new and improved. So if you've done surveys before with us and you opened it and you're like, oh my gosh, this is too many questions and you close out of it, it's different. I promise. It's shorter. It shouldn't take you long. If you could click on that or at least have it open in your browser now, that'd be perfect. When you close out, it'll also populate on your screen too. So please fill out that survey. We also have our specific information on this page as well. So if you want to directly add our crisis line to your contacts, you can do so. You can change the name of how it's displayed for your own safety as well too. And then we have just a final minute for a breath and for just gratitude for you attending this training today. You can follow us on social media. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're almost to 1,000 subscribers. We have over dozens of webinars and educational videos and trauma-informed yoga. As promised, we have the PowerPoint slides and also the certificate of attendance. So all of that will be in the chat as well. So you can click them now. As you would like, but again, it'll be sent. Today is Thursday, so it might be sent on Monday, the follow-up email. All right, we are right at 2:30 Central. Thank you all so much for coming out. Maybe you didn't come out, for showing up to this webinar and for sharing your thoughts in the chat and for being open to learning more about this topic. Let us know if there's any other topics that you want in the future or if there's other organizations that you think we should collaborate. But thank you again and have a wonderful rest of your week. Would you like to say any closing remarks, E? No? Okay. I will go ahead and stop.